Welcome back to the War Room, where we're going to finish our dive into the tactical impact of the late 19th, early 20th century firepower revolution by looking at the Western Front in 1918. It's not a coincidence that the First World War ended in the same year that the main theatre saw its fronts start moving again. The Germans took their swing at victory in the spring offensive from March to July. From then, the Allies launched a string of attacks to the end of the war that became known as the 100 Days. This movement shows that both sides had basically solved the tactical problems created by the rapid development of firepower technology in the preceding 50 years. The British, French, Germans, and the somewhat behind but quickly catching up Americans all understood how the new modern battlefield worked and what methods, tools, and organizational structures they needed to successfully attack and defend. This does not mean that either side was always successful in their endeavours, nor that they could necessarily get results at low cost. It means that the focus of the war shifted. Up to mid to late 1917, all of the belligerents were trying to prosecute the war with a tactical deficit. There was a significant shortfall between the believed pre-war capabilities of units to complete battlefield tasks and their actual capabilities on the modern battlefield. But this was a shortfall that diminished as armies adapted. New weapons, new organisation, and new doctrine recalibrated expectations, and eventually, by the start of 1918, produced a combined arms formula that could be applied to produce tactical results. However, having the recipe for success does not guarantee it. If you don't have the ingredients, then you can't make it work. So the story of 1918 is the story of both sides trying to put that formula into practice at the tactical level, and then leveraging tactical success to achieve higher level effects. It's the Germans who kick things off. The collapse of Tsarist Russia and peace in the East has released significant forces that the Germans can now send to the Western Front. With the British licking their wounds after Third Ypres, and the French still recovering from a string of mutinies in 1917, the German army in early 1918 had the advantage in manpower. But this wasn't going to last. The Americans were rapidly building up forces in Europe, and soon the balance would shift back in favour of the Allies. So, knowing they have a limited window to try and achieve some kind of victory, the Germans start applying the new tactical formula in a series of offensives. Although tactical innovation and development occurred naturally in all units to varying extents, from 1915 onwards the Germans experimented with specific assault formations. As these gained experience with new weaponry, organisational changes and tactical methods, the lessons learned were disseminated across the German army, leading to the creation of assault platoons and companies in other units. These primarily found themselves engaging in trench raids, dominating no man's land, and acting as lower-level instruction cadres. Some units went further and created their own elite assault battalions, which acted as the spearhead of offensive actions and a potent counterattacking force in the defence. These were the German stormtroopers of World War I, the Stoßtruppen or Sturmtruppen, about whom much has been written. In preparation for the Spring Offensive in 1918, the German army started creating entire divisions based around so-called stormtrooper tactics. These were designated as attack divisions and were filled out with the most physically able soldiers, armed with the best weapons, and led by the most experienced officers and NCOs. In the Spring Offensive, the attack divisions were to demonstrate the same German emphasis on depth seen in their defensive reorganisation after the Somme and Verdun. The assault troops were to move through no man's land, bypass enemy strongpoints, and keep moving forward to get into the defenders' depth. Through speed, shock, and violence of action, the aim was to psychologically destabilise the defence, prompt cut-off units to surrender, and propagate a collapse. This required not only physically fit, well-trained and well-equipped soldiers, it also necessitated a looser style of command and control in which subordinates had greater leeway to complete their orders. The less specialised German trench divisions, used for holding ground, would follow up at a slower pace to mop up behind the assault divisions. The first phase of the Spring Offensive kicked off with Operation Michael on the 21st of March. At 0440, the German artillery preparation began, firing a total of 3.2 million rounds, about a third of which was gas, in a complex fire plan. At 0940, the creeping barrage started, and the German assault divisions left their trenches to advance into no man's land. Opposing them, British troops were set up in an unfamiliar new system of defence in depth. Like the German system, this relied on mutually supporting strongpoints rather than a continuous line, but without the experience of repeated defensive battles to cement the new doctrine, and stretched thin to cover a newly extended stretch of front, the British defence was poorly executed. To make matters worse, the morning of March 21st was smothered by thick fog that prevented the British strongpoints from defending one another, provided the German assault troops with ready-made gaps to penetrate, and, worst of all, stopped the British artillery in the rear, seeing the SOS signal rockets fired from the front line. In combination with counter-battery fire and the early morning bombardment cutting the communication wires leading back to batteries and headquarters, the British troops up front found themselves without protective artillery support, quickly bypassed by German Stoßtruppen, and then isolated and mopped up by the following trench divisions. By 1400, the Germans have punched through the British outpost zone. By the end of the day, the troops of 18th Army were deep in the battle zone and had captured 80 guns. The other two German armies in the operation were not as successful on day one. The 17th Army had only penetrated 4 to 5 kilometres and was stuck in front of the British battle zone, while 2nd Army in between them had seen mixed progress corresponding to the forces on its flanks. But as the attack continued, British units finding their positions compromised by the penetrations began to fall back. This led to a patchy, uncoordinated withdrawal which further pressure only exacerbated. The British defence splintered, units losing lateral touch and pulling back away from one another, widening gaps for the Germans to exploit. It's soon clear to everyone that the Germans have punched a hole in the front line. After 3 days, they are through the British defensive system beyond the trenches and are fighting mobile warfare in the country beyond. Amongst the ground seized in the offensive is the entire Somme battlefield of 1916. What took the British and French months to grind through 18 months ago, the Germans have stormed through in less than a week. But despite yielding impressive results, the German success is ultimately poisonous. From the 26th of March onwards, it's clear that the rapid advance is not coherent down through all the attacking echelons. The assault troops are out in front, but have suffered heavy casualties and are exhausted. Behind them, the trench divisions are struggling to keep up with their less physically able troops. Following them, the artillery is bogged down trying to negotiate the kilometres-wide craterscape. The ammunition is lagging behind even further, suffering from many of the same problems. The Germans' combined arms team is rapidly breaking down because the different elements simply can't keep up with one another. The tyranny of distance imposes in other ways too. By the 26th, 18th Army is 56 kilometres from its railheads, stretching out logistics lines and reducing the throughput. By the 27th, the length of front occupied by 2nd Army has ballooned from 25 kilometres to 40, meaning that its logistic support not only needs to expand laterally as well as in depth, but that its force density has to decrease to man the new lines. By the end of Operation Michael, the Germans have made gains unheard of on the Western Front. In 16 days, they've captured 1,200 square miles, taken 90,000 prisoners and 1,300 guns, and inflicted 255,000 casualties on the Allies. The Germans have demonstrated that they've cracked the formula for tactical success. With the right build-up, the right preparations, the right forces, and some degree of surprise and good luck, they can break the deadlock of trench warfare. Without those factors, things can go wrong. And of course, the enemy always has a say. On March 28th, for example, the Germans launch Operation Mars, attempting to widen the right flank of the Michael penetration. The forces in the attack are mostly non-elite trench divisions, and they come up against a solid, well-prepared and well-manned British defence in depth. By 1700 on the first day, having made no progress and suffered heavy casualties, the Germans pull the plug. But even when things go well, tactical success in and of itself is not enough. By the end of the spring offensive in mid-July, the Germans have lost 700,000 men. The elite assault divisions have been gutted, leaving the poorer quality trench divisions to shoulder the burden for the rest of the war. The complex, intimidating defence in depth system of the Hindenburg Line has been left behind and abandoned, starting to decay without proper maintenance over the summer, while the Germans improvised new, less effective positions wherever they had stopped. These new lines were not only much longer, requiring more forces at the front and fewer in reserve, but needed supporting by a wider web of logistics that had to move up from distant railheads over tenuous routes forged through the shattered landscape. In other words, effective tactics can only get you so far. With the tactical problem solved, other elements become dominant. Reserves of manpower and materiel, the effectiveness of industrial mobilization, the will to continue fighting, and the ability to formulate and conduct strategy effectively all take over as determining factors. By mid-1918, with the failure of the spring offensive, the Allies thoroughly outclassed the Germans in all respects. This isn't to say that the Allies eventually won the war solely through attrition. If the Allies had not developed the tactics of modern warfare, it would have taken them a lot longer to bring the war to its conclusion. But in many ways, the German spring offensive was a series of tactical expressions looking for strategic effect. For example, the Germans almost reached the BEF's two major logistics nodes at Amiens and Hazebrouck. Losing either would have greatly complicated the British ability to keep their troops and artillery supplied, and potentially forced them to fall back on the Channel ports. But these two nodes were never really prioritised as objectives by the Germans. Ludendorff in particular, with his infamous phrase, "We will punch a hole, for the rest we will see," seems to have assumed that if the Allies suffered a serious battlefield defeat, higher level strategic or even political effects would automatically follow. The Allies, meanwhile, regaining the initiative after the failures of the spring offensive, are more measured in their approach. They don't expect to win the war in 1918. They simply start launching limited attacks to chew off vulnerable chunks of the new German line or to regain important ground. Tactically speaking, these attacks are similar to those of 1917 with two caveats. Firstly, the Allies now have more experience. Planning and execution is generally faster and more skillful, and, crucially, attacks are not pressed past their culminating point. Once Allied progress in one attack peters out, they stop and avoid pushing forward beyond the scope of their preparations, beyond the point where they run out of script and the combined arms system breaks down. Instead, they launch other attacks elsewhere. This allows the Allies to keep the pressure up across the front and make consistent, if smaller, gains without overextending like the Germans did in the spring offensive. Secondly, the Allies increasingly make use of tanks. It's important to reiterate that tanks did not win World War I for the Allies, and that the Germans were able to achieve dramatic gains in the spring without them, but they are an element of the Allied combined arms team with two key effects. To begin with, tanks obviously bring a suite of capabilities to the battlefield that increase Allied tactical options. If we consider the two immediate obstacles to the infantry to be wire obstacles and German machine gun teams, tanks are able to crush barbed wire, creating gaps for the infantry to push through, and they're able to engage enemy positions with direct fire. These are not abilities that the infantry artillery team don't already have. Infantry can cut wire and assault machine gun nests, artillery can clear wire and suppress or destroy the enemy, but close cooperation with tanks allow the infantry to deal with these obstacles faster and more effectively. The ability of tanks to forge paths through the enemy wire also makes it possible to forego significant preparatory bombardments. Avoiding getting stuck on the wire is so important to the success of the infantry that a good deal of preparatory fire is dedicated to clearing it at the cost of surprise. With tanks able to negate the wire, it's possible to kick the infantry advance and the meat of the artillery fire plan, including the creeping barrage, off at the same time and avoid giving the Germans time to react. Secondly, the existence of tanks forces the Germans into a dilemma. Although tanks are mechanically unreliable and prone to breakdowns, and although various anti-tank weapons exist, from anti-tank rifles to anti-tank mines, the most effective way to stop and destroy Allied tanks is to engage them with artillery in the direct fire role. In other words, to bring artillery pieces forward to function as anti-tank guns over open sights. Artillery is usually kept in comparative safety well behind the front line, preferably in range of the battle zone but out of range of most enemy artillery in order to mitigate counter-battery fire. In the more exposed anti-tank role, it becomes much more vulnerable to the Allied fire plan. It becomes vulnerable to direct fire from Allied infantry and tanks, and at the same time is much harder to withdraw and save if the Allies close in. Getting a gun out of a trench or fortified position by muscle power whilst under fire is not the same as hooking up the horses and bugging out like it is in the rear. But without artillery in the anti-tank role, Allied attacks supported by tanks have a high chance of success. And now that the Allies have the initiative, they're the ones choosing where to attack, so the Germans are forced to grapple with this dilemma across the entire front, despite the fact that the Allies don't have the number of tanks needed to support every single action. By 1918, Germany does not have the guns to sustain the kind of losses this dilemma forces on it, nor the industrial capacity to replace them. So a key component of the tank's effect on the battlefield is actually to force this dilemma onto the Germans and degrade their artillery park, gradually breaking down their ability to prosecute a combined arms defense. These tactical elements are all bound together and directed to achieve strategic effects. The panic caused by Operation Michael in March led to the appointment of Ferdinand Foch as Supreme Allied Commander. This finally allows more effective coordination among the Allies. Instead of prosecuting separate campaigns on different stretches of front and occasionally cooperating, the Allies are now properly coordinated and bent to Foch's will. By late September, the Allies were up to the Hindenburg Line and launched a multi-pronged effort to break it. In the south, the French and Americans fought the Meuse-Argonne offensive. In the centre, the British attacked the Saint-Quentin Canal, and in the north, the Belgians and British punched beyond Ypres. Only a week into October, the Allies were through the Hindenburg Line, compromising the lateral rail network supporting the German front. From then to the armistice in November, the Allies made constant progress. There was no climactic breakthrough or dramatic exploitation, but the Allies were essentially unstoppable. Again, this does not mean that they suffered no losses. The Allies suffered over 1 million casualties in the 100 Days Offensive, and it doesn't mean that the Germans were incapable of repelling individual Allied attacks. But they didn't have the means to do anything but slow down the Allied advance. With the tactical problem solved, it became the Allies' ability to maintain constant pressure and tempo that forced Germany to sue for peace. Tactics are important, and when there is a tactical deficit, when armies struggle to achieve effects at the tactical level, the result can be costly indecision. What we've been looking at in this series is the impact of the late 19th, early 20th century firepower revolution and how that changed the fundamentals of tactics. In 1914, the belligerents on the Western Front went to war fighting on the foundations of thousands of years of military tradition. Massed infantry armed with rifles fought alongside artillery firing over open sights, screened and supported by horse-mounted cavalry in ways that would have been familiar to Napoleon and different but recognizable to Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. But the influence of vastly increased firepower had irrevocably changed the battlefield. The way armies fought in 1914, especially after the Battle of the Marne, did not produce the expected results. There was a tactical deficit. By the end of 1917, after years of development, improvements, experience and casualties, the belligerents had created modern warfare and the tactical deficit had been solved. Tactics are, however, limited. The ability to succeed tactically does not in and of itself achieve anything. Winning battles is not the same as winning wars. So tactics are really an enabler. They're required to make higher level effects possible, but can't achieve them on their own. That's the end of the World War I focus in the War Room. What we're going to do next is go on a bit of a jaunt through history, focus in on some interesting battles and unpick some elements of not just tactics, but operations and strategy. I'm definitely looking forward to exploring some of the time periods. Hope you all enjoyed this little series and found it informative and interesting. I'll catch you in the next video.